Today in Aetherdrift, we get some ridiculous artifact removal, the fastest start your engine's creature yet, and sexy mummies? Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Aetherdrift spoilers. So we're nearing the end of week 1 of spoiler season. We still have another week to go, but today we get some really sweet stuff to talk about, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking spicy new Aetherdrift cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Aetherdrift. So apparently there was a meeting at WotC recently where they sat down and decided that what Magic was missing was sexy mummies? I guess, because our first card today is Cursecloth Wrappings, and mummies aside, this is actually one of my favorite cards from the entire set. It's a 4-mana artifact that gives your zombies +1/+1, and then you can tap it to make target creature card in your graveyard gain Embalm until end of turn, with its Embalm cost equal to its mana cost. So the creature that you target, essentially exile it from your graveyard, you pay its mana cost, and you get a token copy of that card. That's also a white zombie in addition to its other types. So this card, I think, is very interesting. It reminds me a little bit of Liliana's Mastery as this zombie lord that's not in a creature. Reminds me a little bit of like Whip of Erebos, some repeatable reanimation style artifact. I will say, so level 1 of this card is you just use it like weird reanimation. How good it's going to be at that really depends on what you're reanimating. If you're using this to get back cheap creatures, it's kind of insane. Think about Zombify. That's like the #1 reanimation effect in Standard right now. If you're trying to get back in Atraxa, obviously Zombify is going to be way better. You pay 4 mana, you get Atraxa. If you have Cursecloth Wrappings, you got to pay the full mana cost of Atraxa. On the other hand, maybe you want to get back a Fairy Mastermind or something. Spending a whole Zombify 4 mana to get it back feels pretty bad, but Cursecloth Wrappings, you can get back your Fairy Mastermind for just 2 mana. There's another little downside, I guess, which is if you Embalm, you do get to exile the creature, so it's going to be gone forever. You can't reanimate it again in the future, but I think this card has some sneaky potential as some sort of reanimation effect. And then remember that the Embalm creatures are zombies, so anything you bomb with this is going to get +1/+1, so your Fairy Mastermind is going to be a 3/2 rather than a 2/1 or whatever. So what do we do with Cursecloth Wrappings? Answer 1, I think, is played in a zombie deck. Zombies seem like a natural home. You can benefit from the Anthem mode even before you start embalming, and then you can get back whatever, your Death Barons, your Giralfs, your Midnight Reapers, your Rotodropics from the graveyard, and then you even get some other additional synergies. If you're like a Rotodropic deck, you already probably have some token synergies going on, so getting token copies of your zombies might have even more upside. The other possibility, and what I'm most excited about this card, is it's a way that you can turn anything into a token. Any creature in your graveyard, you can get a token copy of that creature, which means if you have a Doubling Season, an Anointed Procession, you can get multiple copies. You can use Caretaker's Talent to copy the token. So there's a lot of shenanigans here by just turning creatures in your graveyard into token versions of themselves. And I think that's the mode that can do some absurd things with this card. As far as Commander is concerned, it seems like a zombie card. It's going to be at its best in zombie decks that also care about the graveyard. The good news is a lot of zombie decks are like that. Like Verena Lich Queen, one of the most popular zombie commanders. It's mass loot mode. You're going to fill your graveyard super quick. Then you can use Cursecloth Wrappings to get those things back. Plus it makes zombie tokens to benefit from the Anthem. Or Jisa and Giralf, the Scarab God, Sidisi. So any graveyard zombie deck really going to like this card. Although honestly, I think you could play it in just any zombie deck and it's probably going to be worth it. I also think I would consider this card in some token decks. Just disregard the zombie text or just use it to pump my Embalm tokens. But like in Kemball or Tisa Karlov, I think the ability to get a token copy of any creature in your graveyard is just incredibly powerful. So Cursecloth Wrappings, this is one of the cards I'm most excited to build around. I don't know if it's going to be a top tier card, but it seems super fun. We also got a new Mu Yangling, and Mu Yangling Wind Rider. And in keeping with tradition, this Mu Yangling, not especially good. I feel like that's kind of Mu Yangling's thing, that always gets really bad cards. A 4-mana 2/4 mythic for some reason, human wizard pilot. When it enters, you create a 3/2 colorless vehicle artifact token with crew 1, vehicles you control have flying, and then whenever one or more creatures you control with flying deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So Mu Yangling, I'm not really sure what makes this card mythic, outside of the fact it's a D-Spark Planeswalker. Maybe that's the reason. Otherwise, this card feels very rare to me, or even like a super pushed uncommon. So is this card any good? And my initial thought is not especially. Maybe making the vehicle token actually is what makes this card good. We've only seen one other card that does this in Chandra Sparkhunter, our new Chandra. Maybe the vehicle's actually what makes this card playable. I guess if you think about it, and you count the vehicle as stats added to the battlefield, which I don't know if you really should since you gotta crew it, there's some extra hoops to jump through, but it's technically a 4-drop that makes 2 bodies, 5 power, 6 toughness. That's a pretty good rate for a blue card, and then you get the upside of maybe drawing a card, giving your vehicles flying. So I guess we'll have to wait and see, but my first read of this card is it doesn't seem that great. The good news is there's plenty of support for it. Like, you can play a blue deck with a bunch of really powerful creatures that you want to play anyway that all have flying, like Spyglass Siren, Fairy Mastermind, Mockingbird, and Pornoculus. Take advantage of the card advantage of hitting your opponents with flyers to draw a bunch of cards. The problem I see with this plan, and I think the biggest problem with Mu Yangling overall, is it feels like bad Enduring Curiosity. Enduring Curiosity is really good. It gets flash. It can draw you a whole bunch of cards in a turn, when Mu Yangling, in a 1v1 game, only ever going to draw you a single card each turn, because no matter how many creatures with flying you hit with, you only get to draw 1 card. So I feel like any deck that might want Mu Yangling in Standard is probably just going to want Enduring Curiosity instead. The one exception would be if some sort of vehicle deck develops. Mu Yangling, it does work really well with Thopter Fabricator. If you hit your opponent with the Fabricator, you're going to draw a card because it has flying. That'll be your second card. You're going to make a Thopter. Plus, we get other good blue vehicles, Possession Engine, Hull Drifter. Sending them to the air seems kind of nice. So maybe there's some weird vehicle deck that develops. But outside of that, I think Mu Yangling is kind of just bad Enduring Curiosity in most decks. As far as Commander, I think there's 2 possibilities. One is if you want to build mono blue vehicles, this is probably your new best go-to option. Right now, the default mono blue vehicle commander is Kasima, God of the Voyage, since it has a vehicle on the backside, but outside of having a vehicle on its back, it doesn't actually really do anything with vehicles. So I think Mu Yangling is the new default mono blue vehicle commander. I also could see playing it in the 99, maybe of like Shikori or Kitori or the new Pia Nalar energy vehicle commander thing. Like, if you're a vehicle commander deck, I think this is pretty good. It does get much better in Commander just because you have 3 opponents, right? And if you read its last ability, whenever 1 or more creatures you control with flying deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. If you have 3 creatures with flying, send 1 to each opponent, they all hit, then you get to draw 3 cards each turn cycle rather than just 1, which does make the card advantage much more impactful. So I think Mu Yangling, it's a commander card. I think it's just outclassed in Standard by Enduring Curiosity. Maybe some weird vehicle deck develops, but outside of that, cool mono blue vehicle commander, and maybe an option for the 99 of some vehicle commander decks. Next up, we get a new Boros sweeper, an Explosive Getaway. So Explosive Getaway, 5 mana sorcery, says exile up to 1 target artifact or creature, return to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, and it deals 4 damage to each creature. Kinda wish it said Planeswalker too, would have been a nice way to maybe deal with a Kaido. So this card, it's kind of like a more expensive Storm's Wrath that lets you blink something to save it. Kind of like a Temporal Firestorm, since that can phase things out to save it from the damage. You also get like a Charming Prince trigger, although really, you're playing this for the Wrath mode. 5 mana sorcery speed blink. Not something you'd play in like a Pin or Monocon deck, unless you're playing it to get value out of the sweeper effect. I guess when you add it all together, its closest comparison, it's probably Boros Time Wipe, really. Boros Time Wipe itself, you get the upside that you're guaranteed to blow up everything. Explosive Getaway, not going to get the biggest creatures always. It's only 4 damage. On the other hand, with Time Wipe, you bounce a creature back to your hand, so you're going to have to spend mana to recast it. Explosive Getaway, you don't have to spend that mana. It's just going to flicker out and come back in on your end step anyway. So is this card playable? And I think the answer is Probably not, but maybe in the right deck. I could see a world where it could be really powerful. The dream is you like have a Biza, maybe an Overlord of the Mizmors, and you cast this, you blink out your thing so it doesn't die, you get it back on your end step, you make even more tokens, and you wipe out your opponent's board. When you pull that off, it's probably going to be a game-winning line. You can also just try to break the symmetry by playing 5 toughness creatures that don't die to it, and then you wipe your opponent's stuff, you get to keep your stuff. So there are some shenanigans here. On the other hand, there's a lot of other options. If you're worried about aggro, something like Pyroclasm, probably going to be better because it's way cheaper. And this is kind of competing directly with Sunfall at the moment. And it's hard for me to imagine most decks are going to value a like pseudo Wrath that might not kill everything that flickers out a creature over Sunfall, which is just like the hardest of Wraths and leaves behind a big incubate. So I think this is a card that, over the short term at least, I don't really expect it to see a ton of standard play. In Commander, I think it's a card for very specific decks. In Commander, the issue of dealing 4 damage becomes even bigger because in Commander, creatures tend to be bigger. People are playing much larger things, where 4 damage in Standard is going to kill a lot of threats, but miss a few. In Commander, it's going to kill a few like utility things, maybe some mana dorks, but it's not going to get the biggest threats. I would consider it, though, in maybe a Blink deck, something like a Pramlicon that you really want to be able to reset at some point during the game. Maybe this is worth it to like kill some stuff and need to reset your commander, or maybe like a Abdul Adrian style Blink deck. Maybe you get enough value out of the Blink mode that it's going to be worth it, even if the Wrath mode's kind of mid. So I think Explosive Getaway, it's a cool design. I really like the flicker plus sweeper effect. I'm just not sure if 5 mana in 4 damage, it's actually going to be enough to be especially playable. We also got a new good boy, a dog mount in District Mascot. So a 1 mana 0/0, but it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it. You can pay 1 in a green, remove 2 +1/+1 counters from it to blow up an artifact, and then when it attacks while saddled, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it saddles for 1. So District Mascot seems like a pretty solid 1-drop. It reminds me the most of Hopeful Initiate, which has a pretty similar starting base and also ability where you get this 1-drop, it gets counters on it eventually, then you can remove the counters to blow something up. District Mascot gonna kind of do the same type of thing. It might not be quite as strong. It starts with a little less toughness. You gotta saddle it to get the counters on it, but still, we're heading into Aetherdrift Standard. If there's one thing we've seen from this set is there are a lot of powerful artifacts, so I think blowing up an artifact actually gonna be pretty valuable. So where do you play this card? I think there's 2 options, maybe 2.5 options in Standard. So option number 1, the mythical green-white counters deck. We've talked about it a few times during spoiler season. So far, this deck hasn't been real in Standard, but it keeps getting more and more support. We got the Ozolith, we got Botanical Brawler, we just got Bulwark Ox and Aetherdrift, now we got District Mascot. In a deck that's all about putting counters on things, this card seems great. Like, it's an on-curve 1-drop, it works with a Themir deck, and it does something important against the meta. The other possibility, and there's actually a weird amount of overlap here, but maybe some sort of saddle deck, or even better, a saddled +1/+1 counter deck like Bulwark Ox cares about counters and saddles. Ornery Tumbleweed cares about counters and saddling. So maybe you can have a deck that kind of does both, but in a saddle deck, you get even more shenanigans for saddling up your creature, more value out of it that way. So that's a possibility as well. The half a possibility is maybe you can just play this as generic artifact removal in like some sort of green base aggro deck. Although here, I feel like in general, Haywire Might is just going to be better since it hits artifacts or enchantments, only non-creature, but still, those are the important things. And you can just always activate it for 1 mana. So this is going to rotate next rotation. So after rotation, I can see District Mascot having more value as just like a good stuff style card. But for now, I think Haywire Might mostly does that same job better. So District Mascot, it's a sweet card. It's a good card. I think it'll see Standard play, at least in those specific decks. And after rotation, might even have some more homes. Next up, we get a vehicle that I think is my pick for best constructed vehicle from the set so far in Demonic Junker. So Demonic Junker, 7 mana for a 4/3 vehicle. It's a black card. It is crew 2, most importantly, it has affinity for artifacts. So in an artifact deck, you can be casting this for a single black mana if you have enough artifacts on the battlefield, which isn't really hard to do. We see people casting Mirror Enforcers and Sojourner's Companions for free all the time, these other 7-mana affinity for artifact cards. And then it says, when it enters, for each player, disrupt to one target creature that player controls. If a creature you controlled was destroyed this way, you put 2 counters on it. So essentially, this is a fel, like a theoretical 1-mana sorcery speed removal spell that gets rid of any creature your opponent has on the battlefield. If you want to squint a little bit, I can see the argument that this is artifact leyline binding almost. Obviously, part of leyline binding's power is it can hit any non-land permanent. Demonic Junker, only its creature, so it's not as good as leyline binding. But still, the way it's going to play is pretty similar. We've seen these cost reduction cards be incredibly powerful in older formats and in standard, and I think that Demonic Junker is another one of these cards. So what do we do with this card in standard? I think there's 2 big things. So first, really good with Simulacrum Synthesizer. This is a 1-mana way, if you get a bunch of artifacts, that's going to trigger your Synthesizer, make another huge construct. So any sort of artifact deck, I think this is going to be a go-to removal spell for that deck in standard. It's also super cute with Repurposing Bay. When they first spoiled our new Birthing Pod for artifacts, we talked about how, like, in Modern, you can use a Sojourner's Companion, a Mirror Enforcer, these big affinity cards, to get a 7-mana value artifact on the battlefield, sack it to Repurposing Bay, grab an 8-mana artifact. Well, now we can do that in standard, where we can Demonic Junker for 1 mana, sack it to Repurposing Bay, and I think the best options are like Graz or Cityscape Leveler, getting them on the battlefield super early to take over the game. So I think this is one of the most important Repurposing Bay cards for standard too. The other place that I think this card's going to be exciting is in affinity in older formats. So we just got back Mox Opal, which is really powered up artifact decks. Mox Opal makes mana of any color, so splashing into black in your affinity deck doesn't seem like a big issue now that Mox Opal's around. And then, like I said before, if you really try to squint hard, it kind of looks a little bit like leyline binding. Like, Modern Affinity is so good at flooding the board with artifacts, you should be able to get the cost of this down to 1 mana by like turn 2, turn 3, like very early in the game, and then just killing anything and having a vehicle left over seems like a great deal. It's also worth noting that in Modern Horizons 3, we got a bunch of support for like black-based affinity, Imscure, Crabomination, Refurbished Familiar, but these cards haven't been enough to really push affinity into black. But now that we got Demonic Junker, I'm curious if maybe we see these cards get reevaluated. Maybe Crabomination affinity is an actual thing now, or Imscure affinity, so worth keeping in mind there as well. In Commander, I absolutely love this card. It gets even better in Commander because it works for each opponent. And I know, I'm not the biggest believer in playing a ton of targeted removal, but in an artifact deck, 1 mana, kill the best thing of each of your opponents. And if you have like some weird sacrifice synergies, maybe killing your own thing even has upside, I feel like this is just a staple. If you're playing like Brea or like Mishra, imagine copying it with Mishra and just blowing stuff up all the time, Imhotep, I feel like this is going to be one of the first removal spells you add to your deck. It's thematic, it's really powerful, it scales with the table in Commander, so I think this card is great there as well. So Demonic Junker, I think this is just one of the best vehicles and maybe one of the best cards that we've seen from the set so far. I think it can see standard play. I think it can see modern play. It should be really good in Commander. So Demonic Junker, keep an eye on this one. It's actually very strong. Speaking of artifact-based removal spells, we got Perilous Snare. And my god, does Wizards love putting loot in the art of this set. I thought this was going to be the Goggles set. It turns out it's the Loot with Goggles set. But it's a 3-mana artifact. It is Start Your Engines. It says when it enters, exile target non-land permanent opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, and then if you get to max speed, you can tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on a vehicle or creature you control. So Perilous Snare, it's Vanishing Light, but it's an artifact rather than an enchantment, with that fringe upside that if you ever get to max speed, you can put some counters on things. Is this card good? I feel like this is a card that would have been busted like 10 years ago, but Banishing Light style removal is just really on the downswing. Removal's too flexible, it's too easy for it to get blown up, it's too temporary. So I think this is much more of a niche card than a staple. Like I said, a decade ago, Banishing Light, Oblivion Rings, those were like legit 4 of removal spells in top tier decks. We're just not there anymore. The good news for this card is it's an artifact, and that is a big upside for some decks. We've seen like Portable Hole see a decent amount of play in Pioneer, even some in Modern, just because it's an artifact. So if you're a deck that needs artifacts on the battlefield and you need some removal, Portable Hole is a way you can support your affinity plan or whatever, while also dealing with your opponent's thing. So I think that Perilous Snare could serve a similar purpose in some sort of artifact deck. You got this, we got Demonic Junker now, you got Simulacrum Synthesizer, you throw it all together, maybe you have some sort of weird artifact control deck. Although, like I said, there are just so many ways that this can get blown up. And I think it's going to get even worse now that Aetherdrift is coming out. Because we've talked before about how Standard is really prepared for enchantments because of Caretaker's Talent, Unholy Annex, all the Overlords. I feel like the same thing's going to happen to artifacts now that we're getting this super artifact heavy set. So I expect we'll see even more Braids and Cease and Desist. Plus you got Sheltered by Ghosts and this town ain't big enough. So I think that Perilous Snare, using it as a removal spell, yeah, it's probably fine in an artifact deck if it's supporting other synergies, but beyond that, it's just a little bit too risky, a little bit too temporary. And if you want a hot take, I don't think this card's actually good in Commander. Even in an artifact deck, the best case scenario, Urza, Chief Artificer, Brea, whatever, choose your favorite artifact deck, I don't think I'd play this card. Like, it's 3 mana, it only hits non-land permanents, it only hits one thing, and it's going to get blown up at some point if their opponent wants their thing back. So even though it looks like a good removal spell for artifact decks, I try really, really hard to avoid Oblivion Ring style effects in Commander, because it's just too easy to have someone have a Vandal Blast or a Farewell or some sort of reset that accidentally deals with your removal spell. At least with the vehicle, the thing's gone forever and it doesn't come back if your opponent blows it up. I think that Perilous Snare, giving the thing back, just kind of kills its playability for me. So Perilous Snare, cool to see an Oblivion Ring move into the artifact sphere. Probably okay in some specific artifact decks, but I don't think the effect's really a chase removal spell anymore. In the world of lower rarity cards, a couple worth shouting out. Stock Up, kind of interesting to me. 3 mana sorcery. Look at the top 5 cards of your library, put 2 in your hand, the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. I think this is just like the best divination ever. I don't know if it's enough better than divination to actually be playable, but I think it might be. Like, at 3 mana, it is kind of slow, but going 5 cards deep and grabbing your top 2, I mean, think about Memory Deluge. Memory Deluge, what, went 4 cards deep, and you got to grab your top 2, and that was a staple. This is even cheaper than that. Yeah, I don't get to flash it back or whatever, but I think this card could be playable in some sort of control deck. Maybe being sorcery speed is a deal breaker. That was part of the power of Memory Deluge, is leave up your mana on your opponent's end step. If you don't got to do anything, you cast it, find what you need for the next turn. So maybe being sorcery's too big of a downgrade, but I think this is worth keeping in mind just because seeing 5 cards and grabbing 2 is actually digging pretty deep. We also got Nesting Bot, which is notable just because it is the cheapest Start Your Engines creature that we've seen so far. So in evaluating Start Your Engines, the thing we've been talking about is how fast can you turn it on? How quickly can you get to max speed? And if you're just trying to get to max speed as soon as possible, Nesting Bot's going to be the best way, or one of the best ways to do that. Just a 1 mana 1/1 that starts your engines. When it dies, you get a servo token, which also works with Start Your Engines. Like, if you play this and your opponent kills it, well, at least you get a 1/1 that might be able to damage your opponent to keep your speed increasing. And then if you get to max speed, it turns into a Savannah line. So it's never going to be like an insane creature, but I think just the fact that it's a close to playable statted creature that's a 1-drop with Start Your Engines, that probably matters to some deck out there. Plus, I mean, making a token when it dies, not bad. We've seen Nezumi Linebreaker, Harrier Spearguard. These aren't staples or anything, but in sacrifice style decks, you sometimes want effects like this. So I think that Nesting Bot, notable mostly because it could be really essential to some sort of aggro Start Your Engines max speed deck. Otherwise, you probably got better options. Of course, we round things out today with a bit of draft chaff that you can check out over on MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Aetherdrift spoilers for today. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Aetherdrift spoilers. Until then, have a spectacular day, everyone, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? We can find yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe check out the Against the Odds, where we played some mono green control in Standard.